few days ago, I put up a video asking if you could spend a night in the northern Michigan woodlands in February, bitter, freezing cold night, and then told you about my experience with having to do just that. Well, I want to finish that story because there was more after that. There were several nights after that. And while that first night was almost an exhilarating experience, the other two nights were hellish at best. So the following day, I stowed my gear, my sleeping bag, in a small shack that I had planned on coming back to that night. And but I didn't feel like carrying the sleeping bag with me. Very stupid mistake, because I couldn't find the place to go back and retrieve it. So I continued on walking Old US 23 between Tawas and Oscoda, and I hope to tell you I was bitter cold. I had found an insulated t-shirt in a abandoned hunting camp, and I gladly put that on, and it helped, but not a whole heck of a lot. And there was a black dog that came up to me. In retrospect, I'm thinking it was a lab, and he started following me, and he went up to a farmhouse, and I was so hungry. I was so hungry, because by this time it was late afternoon. And I knocked on the door, and a man came to the door, and it was his dog, and I told him that I had gotten lost in the woods, and I could find my way home then, but that I was extremely hungry, and asked him if he could spare a sandwich. Well, he had me come into the house, and his wife prepared me a sandwich and gave me something to drink, and they knew who I was, because my face was all over the newspapers and the television, because they wanted me back. And when I found out that they knew who I was, I asked them, I knew they were going to call the police, but I asked them, I told them I was a harm to nobody, and asked them if they would give me a little bit of a head start before they actually called the police. And they said they would, and I believe they did. Well, maybe not, but I headed out across their farm field, and it wasn't long, and I could hear the bloodhounds barking in the near distance as the cops got out there and were looking for me quite quickly. But it was by that time it was late afternoon. That black dog stayed with me that whole time, though, and it was late afternoon, and it was getting very cold, and the sun was going down quickly, and I heard gunshots which signaled the searchers that it was time to stop for the night. And after that, I didn't hear the dogs or anything, and I continued walking through the swamp, and through a woods later, and I walked the dog with me. He didn't want to leave my side, and I walked a long distance down a wooded trail, and I came out on I can't think of the road now, but it goes between Wilbur Township and Lumberman's Monument, and I began walking that road, and as it got dark, it got so bitter cold, and I was so miserable, because except for the dog, I was truly alone. I'd never been so alone in my life. Well, I decided that I was going to go a short ways into the woods and see if I could cover my feet even with leaves to at least warm them up a little bit, because they were hurting from the cold, and that didn't help. So I remembered that the Indians used to start a fire with birch bark. So I found some birch bark, and I tried lighting a fire, and all I got was smoke, and it kept wafting towards my face, and I was choking on it. And I finally gave up and laid back. I took my shoes off, though, because my feet were so sore and swollen that the shoes really hurt them. And that wonderful black dog laid down across my feet, presumably to try to keep them warm. I really believe that that dog was an angel in disguise. Well, after I'd rested maybe an hour, I got up and I continued walking on towards Lumberman's Monument. It was probably about 2 in the morning, and I finally got there. And that's where Buddy, which is what I named the dog, left me. And there was a pavilion there at the monument, and I sat down there, and I thought, well, I wonder if I could get inside the building, and at least I'd be out of the elements. But there was no way to get in without breaking in, and I couldn't bring myself to doing that. And then I heard people talking in the near distance, and I thought, well, they're either skiers or partiers that are out late, or there are still some cops out looking for me. And I was a sitting duck right there. So I dashed off, and I felt like I could hear people chasing me, but I really don't know even now if there was. But the banks out there that lead down to the Sable River are extremely high. And so I started down one of the banks, which offered me some concealment, and then started walking further. And I'm pretty sure that I walked all night. I don't remember resting at all after that. When the sun came up, I came out by a little party store, and I bought some some kind of snack food or something, because I was very, very hungry. And I consumed that, and then I started hitchhiking, which I knew was a risk because of my face being plastered all over the place. Well, a pickup truck with an older gentleman in it stopped in, and he picked me up and asked me where I was going, and I said Curtisville, which was probably about 25 minutes away. And he said he was going that way, so he would take me, and he wanted to know where I was going. And I said that I had an uncle that lived there in Curtisville, and he was expecting me, that I was going to spend some time there with him. And it seemed almost like the guy knew I was lying. I really believe he knew who I was. And when we got to Curtisville, he said, well, I'll take you right to your uncle's house, so just show me how to get there. And I said, no, I'd rather walk in. And he started insisting that I let him take me there. And I said, no, I really, just stop and let me out, because I'd rather walk into my uncle's. And so he stopped and he let me out. And it was getting towards dark again. And I was in an area where it was nothing but cottages and woods. And I stopped at one cottage that had an outbuilding, small outbuilding, and I thought I wouldn't try to break into the cottage, even though I could have found blankets and stuff. Probably I wouldn't break into them. But I tried to get into the outbuilding, and again I couldn't budge the door. So, with no direction, no guidance, I started walking again. And now it was pretty close to nightfall. It was getting dark and getting bitter cold again. And I came to a farm field. And as I was walking across it, I broke through ice in a number of spots. And that bitter cold on my feet that were already cold and aching from the cold just increased my misery 100-fold. And then I saw some spots in the field where steam was rising, and I went over and I looked, and they were where cows had taken a dump. And I figured, well, if the steam's rising off them, it must be warm. And as disgusting as it sounds, I took my shoes and socks off, and I stuck my feet in the cow manure to warm them. And it felt incredibly good. And I did that in 3 or 4 piles, then wiped my feet off as best I could, put my shoes and socks back on, and began walking again. Well, I came to a barbed wire fence, and on the other side of the fence was a dirt road, and I climbed that fence and got over it without even a scratch. And there was a lady coming down the road walking her dog, which surprised me because, it was really way out in the country. And she looked at me without any fear, and she said, are you having a problem? And I said, yeah, I'm lost, which was true. I said, I'm lost, and I said, I don't know which way to go for help. And she said, well, you just go up here to a little ways to the crossroad, turn left, and you'll see an old Baptist church there. The steeple will be lit up. The parsonage is right next door. Just go there and tell them what's wrong, and they'll help you. And I thanked her, and so I continued walking, trying to stop shivering uncontrollably. And I walked up to the door of the parsonage and knocked, and the elderly preacher came to the door, and he looked at me and asked how he could help me, and what was wrong. And I gave him the story also about being lost and so cold. He knew who I was, though I didn't know that right then, but he knew who I was. But he saw something in me, he told me later, that he knew I was not a danger, and that the things that were being said about me were lies perpetrated by my ex-wife. But anyways, he let me in, and while his wife fixed me a delicious dinner, a delicious hot meal, they let me go into the bathroom, take a warm bath, and when I was done, even though he was much bigger than I was, they brought out they gave me clean clothes to put on, and I remember having to tie the top of the pants to make them stay up. And afterwards, he asked me what I was going to do. He said, "You're welcome to stay here for the night." And I was afraid, though. So I didn't know at that point that he knew who I was, but I kind of suspected that he did. So I said, "No, I think I could find my way to my uncle's house," which I told him the same story. And I left, but he invited me. That was a Saturday night, and he invited me to the church service the next morning. And I left. And it wasn't long, and I was wishing I had have taken advantage of staying with them that night, because it was so ungodly cold. It was bitter, and I had no protection. And I found a house that looked as though it was all boarded up for the season. And again, behind it, there was a garage or a small barn. And I went in there, and there was no place to lay down. And it wasn't any warmer in there, but at least I was out of the wind. And I went in, and I laid down on a large pile of lumber. And I couldn't sleep. I was in such misery, such agonizing misery. And I got back up and walked outside, looked around the house to see if there was any way to get in without breaking any windows or doors. And there wasn't. So I went back out to that barn, and I shivered uncontrollably, almost to the point of having seizures the rest of that night. And when I heard at dawn, or just before dawn, a few birds start to sing, I knew it would be light soon. And I got up and I left, and I started walking again, because I wanted to go back to that church. And there was another party store there, and I went in and I bought a couple things to eat, and I bought a package or two of cigarettes, and went back out, sat down in the woods because it was way too early for the church, and in a couple hours, I headed back to where I knew the church was. And the pastor was already at the church. It was still a while before the church service was going to begin. And he asked me to come in anyways and sit down and talk with him and pray with him. And when I did, I broke down and I told him the truth. And he just smiled at me warmly and patted my shoulder, and he said, he said, I knew last night who you were. And he said, I knew you were not really any danger. And he told me that him and his wife wanted to help me. And if I turned myself in, they would do everything they could to help me. But I wasn't ready to give up. Because I don't know what I was thinking, but I wasn't ready to give up. Well, before church, I helped him with some cleaning around the church, and it was warm. And I stayed for the service. And after service, I ate lunch with them. And again, they asked me about they said they wouldn't force me, or they wouldn't call the police on me. But they asked me again to consider turning myself in and getting this all taken care of, which was wise advice. It would have been taken care of much more easily had I heeded what this man of God said to me, but I didn't. And I asked them if they would take me to a friend's house near Black River, north of Black River, and drop me off there. And they agreed to do that. So they took me up to Norman and Betty Brown's house and dropped me there. Prayed with me before they left and dropped me off there. And Betty and Norman were people that I knew well from working at a senior center up there. I had served them meals, 5 days a week at the senior center. And they let me in. And they were so worried, because they really cared about me. And they knew what had happened. And they had seen the story from the start when my ex-wife left me and took my kids. And they had me in, and we talked for quite a while, and they too tried to talk me into calling the police and turning myself in. But I didn't. And so I asked them if they would give me a ride out, can't think of the name of the road, but it's in Black River, and it leads out to Negugan State Park, a wilderness state park. And I thought, if I get out there, I figured I'm savvy enough that I could survive. Yeah, right. But they took me out there and dropped me off. And they were so worried, though. They didn't want to. But they dropped me off, and I knew of an abandoned building just off that road. And I made it to that building. It was old. It was pretty dilapidated. It was easy to get into because all the windows were broken out, but it was in two sections. In the one section, there was no windows, and you're kind of barricaded from the wind. And it was getting to be a damn cold night again. And there was an old beat-up recliner in there, and that foam padding like they use under the under carpeting. And so I had with me a loaf of bread, peanut butter, jelly, and a knife. And I had several packs of cigarettes. And I made myself a sandwich, got on the recliner and put one of those foam pads on me. And for the first time, I felt kind of at ease. I remember, though, that whole night, cars going up and down that road, which was, I thought, highly unusual because it was winter and very few people would be going out to Negugan State Park. So I figured, maybe the Browns had told on me and the cops were out there looking for me. I didn't know, but I was really careful with lighting my cigarettes because I didn't want anybody to see the flame if they were passing by. I didn't know if they could or not. And I slept there that night. And for the most part, I slept pretty good. Pretty good. Well, the next morning I woke up, had another sandwich and a cigarette, crawled back out the window, and started down that dirt road back towards the road which led between Black River and US 23. I can't think of the name of it now. But I got about halfway down the road, and there is a curve in the road, and a sheriff's car came tearing around that curve, threw on his brakes, and he stopped the car and hopped out with his gun pulled, and he said, "Get down on the ground now." And so I did, and he came over and he grabbed my arms and put my hands behind my back, and while he was holding the gun at the back of my head, and to use his words, not mine, he said, "If you make one fucking move, you're dead." And I kind of laughed, and I said, "What's the point?" I said, "I'd like to be dead right now anyways." But he got the cuffs on me, and he yanked me up as hard as he could and threw me against the hood of the car, and was insisting that I tell him where my gun was. Well, I had never had a gun, because I had never ever owned a gun, and I didn't want a gun. But my beloved ex-wife had everybody convinced that I was armed and extremely dangerous. And they believed her, of course. Everybody believed everything that witch said. But he got me in the car, and he took me to the jail in Alcona County, Harrisville, where I think I spent the night there before I was picked up and taken back to Iosco County. But it was really fortuitous that I was stopped and found when I was, because late that evening it started in a real blizzard, and it just buried Iosco and Alcona counties, and there was no way that I would have survived it. So even though that officer was rough and rather barbaric, he really did me a great service by arresting me, because, like I said, I would have probably been found frozen to death in the spring. But that's how the rest of that story went that I started to tell you in the first video. There's a lot more to it, but that's all I feel like sharing right now. So thanks for taking a listen. If you stuck along with me this long, thank you. And God bless, and have a great evening.